Wow. Pura vida. Much love and respect. Thanks for tuning in once again. Again, I'm an Access Genealogy, a free genealogy website. All right, continuing in Access Genealogy. Continuing says French Protestant refugees and privateers. Now, we already know the story of the Protestants. Back in the book, Jews and Muslims in British colonial America. Again, we're going over the information and corroborating with the website Access Genealogy. Going over real quick parts of this book. This is in chapter 2, Sephardim in the New World. It says Arbil also stresses that Sephardic Jews consider themselves one community, nation, whether they openly practice their faith or were privately observant but publicly Protestant or Catholic, right? They were really Sephardic Jews. A little further ahead, it says here, Marcus series. This is what Jacob R. Marcus in his book, The Colonial American Jew, had to say. Says he emphasizes that many of the Iberian refugees publicly belong to Huguenot, Walloon, or other Protestant denominations. He also acknowledges the crypto-Jewish and openly Jewish Sephardic communities in the Netherlands were served as the seedbed for the large-scale return of the Jews to England beginning about 1650. All right, Protestants includes what? The crypto-Jewish Sephardic community, cryptos. Real quick, in chapter 5, this is about the New York colony, Dutch, British, and Jewish. Again, we read every single chapter of this book in different videos, so make sure to catch up to the presentations. We're going over the information and corroborating with that website, getting a deeper understanding so we can retain this and understand who the colonists were a lot of the time, and these were black folks. And over here it says in 1624, the West Indies Company made the decision to plant colonies in North America. Not surprisingly, given what we have already seen of the English strategy, the company used Sephardim as antagonists in the first onslaught. The earliest settlers were Walloons, Protestant refugees from the southern Netherlands who displayed willingness to risk wives and children towards immigration, as we have witnessed happening repeatedly from Roanoke to Jamestown, from Plymouth Rock and Boston to the shores of South Carolina and Maryland. Former Sephardim and Moors now surfacing in various hues of Protestantism were placed aboard ships and transported from Western Europe to North America. Again, they weren't coming from Africa, these Moors, Western Europe to America, Western Europe to America. A middle passage, but in a different way. How they told you, Sephardim and Moors transported aboard ships from Western Europe to North America. In addition to the Walloons came French Huguenots, who were also Moors, recruited by one Jesse de Forest Silva. All these incoming, ostensibly Dutch settlers received free passage and an allotment of land to cultivate on their own usage. All right, who are the Protestants? You guys understand? This is chapter 6, Pennsylvania, Quakers and other friends. All right, that's the hijack with the whitewashing. Using immigrant records, church rolls, and family genealogies, we are going to paint a different picture of colonial Pennsylvania, one that includes many settlers of Sephardic and Ashkenazic Jewish, Ottoman, Turkish, and other types of Moorish descent. We are going to argue that prior historians have inadvertently overlooked or perhaps purposely ignored evidence that many of the Protestant sects arriving in Pennsylvania, example, the Mennonites, were crypto-Jewish congregations, all right, crypto-Jews, Sephardic Jews, people of color, led by a rabbinical-style minister, all right? Protestants, who's the Protestants? We're in chapter 9 of this book. It says here, Georgia, the last colony. Says here, plot thickens, Plot thickens. Start right here. It says, one might ask, why Frenchmen were granted lands in Georgia at a time when Britain was engaged in a bitter struggle with France, one that would only end with that country's surrender and complete withdrawal from North America. Although these Frenchmen may have been outwardly Huguenots, who's the Huguenots, right? They were Moors. It is apparent from their names that they were Sephardic Jews, all right, and Jews underneath the Protestant veneer. They were just hiding under the Protestant veneer. Who's the Protestants? Says here, although the bulk of the refugees fled to North Africa and the Ottoman of Turkish lands, that's the hijack. No, they didn't. Thousands of others, how many thousands? Give us real numbers. Sought safety in France and the Low Countries. As Protestantism swept across Western Europe, many of these Jewish conversos and Moriscos, Moors, became often only outwardly Protestant. Only outwardly, that was their cover. Who Moors, that was their cover, Protestant. Swelling the ranks of the dissenters, some even provided leaders for the Huguenots, Hussites, Anabaptists, Calvinists, German Reform, Walloons, Mennonites, Dunkards, Quakers, Puritans, and Presbyterians. When the British, Dutch, and French began establishing colonies on the Atlantic seaboard, they sent as colonists not subjects of high political and social rank from their respective countries, but for the most part recently arrived, patently anti-Catholic, newly minted Protestants, all right? So it was actually Moors and Sephardic Jews. Many were debtors, prisoners, or servants, casts of society who were struggling to get onto their own feet in a new country, all right? All right, so we're back in accessgenealogy.com. Now they're talking about French Protestants. Now we understand, right, what that means, Moors, refugees, right, and privateers. According to documents that will be discussed in subsequent sections, several of the survivors of Fort Caroline established permanent residence in the Georgia mountains. So we just read about Fort Caroline. Those Huguenots, when they escaped, when everything was over, they settled in the Georgia mountains at the invitations of the kings of Appalachia and Ustanali. You see, they invited them over. Come stay with us. At the time, the majority of French mariners were Protestant. Who's these Protestants we just read, right? They were just outwardly Protestant. They were crypto Jews, crypto Muslims, or Moors. Many turned to privateering or pirating, right? Pirates, as a means of covertly combating the Catholic League in Spain. That's how they got back on the Catholics. They were raiding their ships, remember? Through the privateers operating off the Florida Straits, the Fort Caroline survivors got word back to France of a sanctuary for Protestants in the Appalachian Mountains. They were subjects of the Native American king of Appalachia, but persuaded him to become a Christian. Oh, be a Christian like us, really? Wow. Now remember who these Protestants are? This is very deep information. And see how they're settling with the people of the king of Appalachia and Ustanali. And what do you think they did? They definitely mixed with the women there. They had families. These were not white people. These were Moors, people of color, so-called Negro people that were mixing with American Indians. It's in a lot of people's ancestry. Now we're going to talk about Sir Francis Drake at the first Roanoke Colony, 1586. Let's see what it says here. It says, after burning St. Augustine, the fleet of Sir Francis Drake sailed north to check on the health of the Roanoke Colony. They burned St. Augustine Fort. Why'd they do that? Because it was in the control of Catholics. The Catholics, their enemies. Who's Sir Francis Drake? We're about to see. In his ships, he carried approximately 386 African slaves and former Turkish prisoners of war captured at St. Augustine. All right, that's the hijack with the whole African slaves. Access genealogy, that's the hijack, right? We're way past that now. Some scholars have interpreted his archives to indicate that Drake set free on a South Atlantic beach some or all of the men that he carried away from St. Augustine because he did not have enough food reserves to feed them and resupply the Roanoke Colony. Do you hear that? He let all of them go. The so-called African slaves. These are all people of color, right? Like Europeans and Indians. And Indians, not Africans. If the story is true, these freed captives may have been able to survive within the interior of the Southeast. However, there is other evidence that suggests that no freed captives were released at Roanoke Island. Some may have been released elsewhere, but Drake's memoirs are vague on this subject. All right, so real quick, since we're getting into Francis Drake, I invite you to go watch part 3 of Sephardic Crypto Moriscos in British colonial America. It says here, Raleigh, Drake, W.D. Fard, Hawkins, Moore. In this part of the video, they're talking about Walter Raleigh, break down how he is a crypto Jew and how he is a cousin also to Drake, Francis Drake. Yeah, they're cousins. These families were not only heavily intermarried, generation to generation, but also implicated in settling colonial America. The Champernowns, the Raleighs, Gilberts, Drakes, and Carus were ardent Protestants. Who's the Protestants, right? Cryptos, right? By the late 1500s. But before that, they were, we suggest, in varying degrees, crypto Jews. They were people of Jewish heritage, mutually recognized, who had begun to dissemble their roots and religion since the forced conversion of English Jews under Edward I in 1290. They were actually Sephardic Jews. All right, and this is a more real depiction of Francis Drake. Shout out to Troy Johnson who painted this and sent this to us so we can have it and we can break some spells. That's a true depiction of Francis Drake, Sephardic Jew. In this part of the video, talking about Francis Drake, he was born around 1540, kinsman of the Hawkins family, and again the Raleigh family. They're all Sephardic Jews. Drake's resentment of Spain became a passion. They meant the Catholics. He learned sailing, as did most of his compatriots, from Sephardic and Morisco navigators, like Martin Cortez and Pedro de Medina. Continues, says, in May 1572, Drake set sail for Plymouth in a ship named the Swan and the Pasha. Arriving in Panama, he formed an alliance with a group of French Huguenots, privateers. All right, those are his boys, Moors, Huguenot, privateers, other pirates just like him. These, we can surmise, included many crypto Jews, if a study of the antecedents of Huguenots among refugees of the Spanish Inquisition can be believed. All right, they succeeded in capturing a Spanish treasure, right? A Catholic treasure caravan totaling 300 tons of silver. Drake returned to England not only stupendous a wealthy man, but also national hero, catapulted to the highest fame. Okay, so again, they were in this personal war with the Catholics, talking about the Moors and the Jews, the people of color against other people of color. It's not about black and white. It's not about the English versus the Spanish. It's a lot deeper than that. All right, now I want to bring you to this other video that I have. It's called Virginia's Not So English Colony. Yeah, these weren't English how they want us to think English. A lot of them were coming from England, Scotland, and Ireland, but they weren't so-called English. Sephardic Moorish Jamestown and Roanoke, all right, because we're talking about Roanoke and Axis genealogy. Roanoke, huh? You're saying a lot of people got left behind there? Moors and Sephardic Jews? Genealogical history here. Make sure to catch the whole video. We're going to go over a little part here. In this part of the video, we're in the book, again, Jews and Muslims in British Colonial America, A Genealogical History by Elizabeth Hirschman and Donald Yates. We're in chapter 3 of this book, as you see, Virginia, first and not so English colony. And it's letting us know who the people of Roanoke really are. Down here it says the stock he proposes of these people as settlers of this new frontier were Englishmen and women who might be regarded as surplus to the needs of their own land. These surplus persons, we will show, are those recently driven to England by religious persecution in Iberia and France, conversos and Moriscos. That's your Roanoke colony right there, who were adamantly anti-Catholic and desperate enough to climb aboard a cramped, unsafe boat to settle in a faraway terra incognita, an unknown land inhabited by ravening beasts and treacherous natives. All right, they took the risk. They had no choice, these Moors and Sephardic Jews. You guys understand? A lot of the people who are funding this venture or this trip, he goes over it, as you guys can see if you pause it and read it yourself, are crypto Jewish Sephardic Moorish names. They're helping their people escape the Inquisition that's still going on by the Catholics. Halleck's efforts to promote the planting of Virginia were assisted by his friend Martin Basnier, Sephardic surname, a Parisian printer. He also obtained permissions from cartographers Laudonnière. Remember Laudonnière, who that is? He was the one that built Fort Caroline. He was a Huguenot. Huguenot is a Moor. And Mendoza, Sephardic surname, to reprint portions of their navigational tracks on the New World. This type of international effort to direct surplus persons to a new homeland was quite unlikely to be undertaken except by organizers who had a personal interest in the matter. The monopolization of the British colonization efforts by a handful of interconnected, intermarried families in Cornwall and Devon, Chapter 1, right, we went over it in this book, is best explained as a massive refugee relocation effort. They were trying to relocate their people, the refugees, the Iberians, Moors, and Sephardic Jews. Just as Zionists finally succeeded in establishing a state of Israel after the Holocaust, it seems probable that a similar plan underpinned attempt by British crypto Jews, Sephardic conversos, and Moriscos to establish a new Jerusalem on the Atlantic shores of North America. We're talking about Roanoke and Jamestown here, filled with refugees, Black Europeans. It says here the first voyage to Roanoke in 1584 had as captains Philip Amadas and Arthur Barlowe, both of whom, to judge by their surnames, were almost certainly Sephardic. As before, the ship stopped first at the Canary Islands, a land with a large converso Morisco population. That's where they stopped first. Upon reaching the North American mainland, near Cape Fear, the ship's log discusses Captain Aubrey and Captain Bonneton's Sephardic surname, a trading family later active in Jamaica. The list of colonists left to settle at Roanoke is given in Appendix E. In the original spelling of the time, with a bit of decipherment, the pattern seems clear. Can names such as John Gostigo, Antoine Ruse, Thomas Parre, Joseph Borges, Spanish surname, and Bennett Baruch, Chapel, not to mention just Chappelle, right, like Huguenot, not to mention Dugan Ganis, our friend Joaquim Gans, be those of typical Britons? Obviously not, right? So then it goes on to talk about the second Roanoke colony. It says 2 years later, another colony was established at Roanoke. Its leader was a civilian named John White, an artist and adventurer known to speak Spanish, who evidently had Spanish connections. He was quite familiar with the coastal interior of the Spanish, who attempted in 1571 to establish a mission there. So right here, they're talking about the lost colony in Roanoke, right? We all know what happened in the stories. You know, they didn't really do good. It says here, the only trace left by the second colonist was the word Croatoan, carved in a tree. As before, they present a markedly un-English impression. The occupations of lawyer, professor, mathematician, and the like, as well as the Mediterranean foodstuffs they carried as provisions, do not appear anything like the norm for Northern European pioneers in the New World. All right, they're letting you know these are Sephardic Jews and Moors. The settlement date of 1587 was only 1 year before the well-announced Spanish invasion of England. These surplus persons who had hardly gotten their feet on the ground in England were willingly enlisted as a voyage to America provided the means to escape the feared arrival of the Inquisition. All right, that's deep. Why would they be fearing the Inquisition, the Catholics, these English people? If they were Christian, why would they be so afraid? Because they were Sephardic Jews and Moors. Their enemies was the Catholics. They were after them. The Inquisition was about them. The Roanoke people, you see, they were fleeing. That's why they desperately went and tried to colonize this part of America so they can survive. Numerous studies of the so-called lost colony of Roanoke have attempted to locate survivors among the mixed tribes of North Carolina, including the Occaneechi, the Lumbee, Tuscarora, the Cohaiti, and various Algonquin groups in the area. C.D. Bruinton, a distinguished native of Sampson Cove, wrote The 5 Civilized Indian Tribes of Eastern North Carolina, with historical facts about these Indians whose descendants are still here, and evidence of their intermarriage and life with the whites from Sir Walter Raleigh's Lost Colony, all right, so-called whites. Yet an equal number of books and articles have attempted to demonstrate that the Englishmen and women from Roanoke Colony could not have survived for long in the wilderness and so never managed to join together with local Indians, right? That was their guess, and that's what they told us in school, so we could just forget about it, so we wouldn't even look for these people, because the reality is that it was Sephardic Jews and Moors. They didn't want us to start looking into this. They claimed that Virginia Dare, probably a Jewish surname in origin, the first white, so-called white, remember white includes Moors, child born in English America, and John White's granddaughter probably died of starvation, probably in the woods, or fell with an Indian tomahawk in her skull. There are significant genealogical indications of the lost colonies blending with the Indians. All right, and then they go over these names right here. It says more, and all these names you guys can see here: Ephraim, Maynard, Emmanuel, Jacobs, Cobb, Cluas, Green, Chloe Flowers. Continuing on the next page, Davis, Jones, Boone, Bell, Collop, Grice, Freeman, Green, Sweet, Hess, Carvers, Chavis. So many of these names are either Melungeon or Sephardic Jewish or both. A common name in Lumbee tribe that probably derives from a medieval Jewish name is Brave Boy. A 1292 census of Paris lists numerous wealthy Jews from Brabant, a Flemish city with ties to the cloth, weaving in the woolen industry of Lombardy. The Brabant Brebois, Bradby, a family that supplied multiple chiefs to the Pamunkey Indians of Virginia, may be a corruption. Bradby, Brabant. These are Sephardic Jewish names, a lot of them, and they were mixing with the American Indians, and that's okay. All right, so I just wanted to go ahead and go over that since we were talking about Roanoke and Axis genealogy. Make sure to get the whole video. You know, it's 2 hours and 40 minutes long. Make sure to get all the information. Very good video. Again, shout out to Troy Johnson. So back in Axis genealogy, they talk about the second Roanoke colony. We didn't read that yet. Just going to go ahead and read that. It says in 1587, 112 men, women, and child were left stranded on Roanoke Island, North Carolina, with no scouts, no experienced hunters or fishermen, no hope of feeding themselves on the infertile soil and surrounded by hostile natives. So why would they do that? Why would they not bring anybody who can hunt or fish? Because they didn't have time. They just brought whoever they can bring. They weren't planning on bringing experts to colonize. They were fleeing. Now we understand, right? It would be 3 years before Governor John White would be able to return briefly to check on their well-being. They were gone. They had disassembled their houses before leaving. There were no skeletons or signs of violence. It is one of America's favorite historical legends, all right? So anything people say is conjecture. And when you think logically, and you know the Indians, a lot of them are friendly. If they conducted themselves in peace with the indigenous population and knowing that some of these tribes are friendly, they would have asked for help and they might have helped them survive. All right, continuing an Axis genealogy website. They have a part right here that says English colonists from Virginia. All right, English. Remember, we just read not so English. A lot of those so-called English were actually Sephardic Jews and Moors. So there are several published 17th century books reported that a party of English colonists in 1621 had originally planned to settle in Virginia, but arrived on the coast just as the massacres of the Powhatan Rebellion were occurring. The colonists headed south, but were persuaded by either the ship's captain or someone on board the ship to seek refuge in the Appalachian Mountains, all right? The reason they did that is because we're going to read the Appalachian king was very friendly for some reason with the Sephardic Jews and the Moors, people that were fleeing the Catholics. So somebody on board knew that. He said, let's go to the Appalachian Mountains. The king of the Appalachian let them stay in Nacotchee Valley. The colonists found the place so agreeable that they asked to settle there permanently. As will be discussed in part 6, several French Huguenot eyewitnesses encountered the descendants of the English colonists in the late 1600s and worshipped with them in Protestant chapels. So you understand that the king even let them stay there and practice their religion and build churches and everything. We're about to read that, okay? Before we read that, just to corroborate again, as it says here, Sephardic Jews, the first European colonists of the Southern Highlands, Helen, Salty, and the Nacotchee Valley. And we go to this part. It says Portuguese converses flee to the New World. The evidence of European occupation of the Southern Highlands prior to the arrival of the Cherokees. Who's the Cherokees? We're going to break that down, right? You guys already know that's a confederation of a lot of different people. That word didn't exist here before Europeans arrived. So before the Cherokee arrived in this area, there's a whole history there too. So the European occupation of the Southern Highlands prior to the arrival of the Cherokees is substantial, but has never been researched by professional archaeologists. No professional effort has been made to locate the Dukes Creek Spanish village site. Almost all the evidence suggests that the Spanish colonists in the Southern Highlands were Jewish. Some vague North Carolina cultural memories recall Portuguese miners living in the mountains. These were, in fact, Sephardic Jews who escaped Iberia via Portugal. They told strangers that they were Portuguese so as to conceal their Jewish heritage, all right? We read that earlier with the Melungeons. All right, I want to read this part here regarding Sequoia. All right. One of the many mysteries about Sequoyah is his skills as a silversmith. From age 10 to 15, he lived with his mother on the Little Tennessee River. He then joined the Chickamauga guerrillas, with whom he fought continuously until 1793, when most of their army was killed at the Battle of Etowah Cliffs in what is now downtown Rome, Georgia. All right. The Chickamauga were at constant war. Sequoyah took refuge in the Natchez Cherokee village of Pine Log. He immediately started making a handsome living as a skilled silversmith. In his spare time, he developed his famous syllabary. The syllabary that Sequoyah created incorporated letters identical to those of medieval Georgian script. Really? So his letters were very identical to... They're talking about Georgia, the country, right? In medieval times, but he's in Georgia already, in America. So how do we know this is not the original Georgia? And he's just writing what his ancient ancestors wrote too. But that's an interesting thing, right? Which was based on the Jewish Aramaic script. Jewish Aramaic script, that's what the medieval Georgia script is based off. Elias Bodinat, editor of the Cherokee Phoenix newspaper, changed Sequoyah's original design so that they would resemble Roman-style lettering. So he switched it up so people wouldn't put two and two together. How did Sequoyah learn how to create fine silverware? How could he have possibly known medieval Aramaic and Georgian script? The possible answers point towards his father actually being a Sephardic silversmith. Oh, we know his mom was an American Indian. Who was his dad? Who was Sequoyah's dad? His dad was a Sephardic silversmith. The word Sequoyah was originally his mother's name and has no meaning in Cherokee, but in his Creek language form meant war captive in the 1700s. There is currently no knowledge of exactly what happened to the conversos of the Southern Highlands. There is a hybrid population in the mountains of Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky who call themselves the Melungeons. Many have found to carry Mediterranean DNA along with DNA of Northern Europeans and Native Americans. However, it is not likely that the Sephardic gold miners of the Nkoshi Valley traveled northward through Cherokee territory to escape the Cherokees. Those that survived Cherokee attacks may have moved to French Louisiana, which had no Inquisition. All right, so now they're going to show the writing. So this is the one they try to make into look like European writing, cursive, right? And this is Sequoyah's original writing. You guys see? It looks very Aramaic. Many of the letters in Sequoyah's original syllabary are identical to those of Aramaic and medieval Georgian. Right now we're going to read the book, The History of the Caribbean Islands. This was written originally by Charles Rochefort and translated into English, right? This is from 1666, all right? Very old book. Now continuing in page 245, we're going to get to the part where an Axis genealogy was telling us that there was some English families that made their way into the Appalachian Mountains. So after the French Huguenots were in this area, spreading the Christianity, right? Their Protestantism. These English families, the ones that they were talking about in Axis genealogy, actually came again with the whole Christian thing. It says these families came out of Virginia in the year, and it says MDC XX1, that's 1621. I was able to verify that one, as you guys can see, with an intention to go to New England to avoid the frequent incursions and massacres committed there by the savages. But the wind proving contrary to their design, they were cast on the coast of Florida. When they passed into the province of Matica, and thence into those of Amana and Bemaring, in the last they settled themselves, and have drawn thither a considerable number of ecclesiastics and persons of quality, who have there laid the foundations of a small colony. Most of those who are retired into those places so remote from all commerce in the world undertook that generous design in the midst of the great revolutions which happened in England during the late troubles, and the main business they proposed to themselves at that time was only to make their advantage of so seasonable a retreat that they might the more seriously and with less distractions mind the attainment of their own salvation, and dilate the limits of Christianity among those poor people, if God gave them the means. All right, if you guys didn't understand that, these English families, as it was telling us in Axis genealogy, how the king of Appalachia allowed them to practice their Protestantism, and they even met French Huguenots who started practicing with them. That's what they're saying. They made a lot of ecclesiastics or people like them, right? These were the French Huguenots who had already been there. A lot of the survivors of Fort Caroline and a lot of the French people, again, that survived Fort Caroline, the attack of the Catholics, ended up with the King of Appalachia. They were already there. They were so happy to meet these English families, and then they started creating their churches and stuff and congregations and spreading the Christianity. Yeah, these are black folks doing that to American Indians. We understand also by the last papers that have been sent us from America that God blessing the endeavors of the first inhabitants of this small colony. They have within 12 or 13 years baptized most of the officers and the most considerable heads of families in the provinces of Bermarin and Amana. All right, look what they're doing. They're evangelizing all the Indians. These are Moors and Sephardic Jews. That at the present they have bishop and many learned a zealous ecclesiastic among them, who carry on the work of the Lord, and the more to advance it, they have built colleges in all those places, colleges where there are churches, that the children of the Appalachites may be introduced in the mysteries of Christian religion and true piety. All right, you see what happened? They let them settle in there, and then they started spreading the Christianity, and the Indians went for it. American Indians, right? So it wasn't always by force. It wasn't always by force. We're actually going to get into this book a lot more now that I found it. It contains a lot of great info, first-hand accounts. I love reading these old books because it's primary sources. You can see what they were saying. But I'm going to end it right there.